Hello, everyone, and welcome to our penultimate Monday guest speaker series meeting for this session. With us tonight, we have three members of KIOS, the Kentucky Open Source Society group, and they are here to talk about how to get started contributing to open source, as well as what is open source. We have Liang Yan, Devin Phillips, and Dr. Jess Squires. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks.
I'm going to hand the presentation over to you. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in chat. There will also be time to ask questions at the end of the presentation if we have a little bit extra time. So please feel free to ask either way, and I'll be around if anyone has any technical difficulties. So there you go. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Devin, I've started sharing, but I'm going to let you go ahead and start since you're the first intro slide here. So why don't you give the title and launch us in, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so when Brian and Emily invited us to do this panel session tonight, we were talking about Jeff, Liang, Ami, a couple of others of us, about how open source has impacted our careers, and we felt like that was a great way to start this conversation. Jeff, are you just going to put it in slide mode, or are you just going to sit here in edit mode?
Let's see.
There we go.
Still share. There we go.
That works. And so we each wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background of how open source has impacted our careers. And so if you'll advance the slide, I think we'll start off by describing a little bit about what is open source. And we were discussing this in our prep call yesterday about how do you define open source, because to different people it means different things, but in broad terms, it's software where the source code is available to you as an end user to see, read, and modify to improve it for your own purposes. Now, you can, in general, there are different styles of open source. Some of them have more restrictive licenses around them. Some of them have less restrictive licenses. And so depending on what level of purist you might be, some of those licenses qualify as open source, some of them don't. But that's on an individual basis or on an organizational basis. So that covers a little bit of why there are many definitions. And if we'll go to the next slide, please, Jeff. I am these days a senior consulting architect at Red Hat. You might know Red Hat as quote unquote that Linux company. The way we like to say it is we're the world's largest open source software solution provider. In other words, we sell support and support subscriptions around open source software. We have no intellectual property. Everything we do upstream in the open source community first. And then we sell support services around that and consulting services around that. So how did it start out? Well, I started out going to Emily's alma mater, Indiana University, and realized very quickly that my professors didn't really care whether or not I passed or failed. And so I did the typical thing that a teenage boy would do and got into a lot of trouble and missed classes and didn't do very well. So I dropped out and joined the US Navy and learned a lot about electronics, a lot about physics. And after I got out of the Navy, I fell into working for a company where somebody introduced me to FreeBSD Unix. And this was around about 1997. And I was kind of blown away. There's this free operating system I can actually try out, and started playing with it. And then I switched over to Red Hat Linux, found an open source community where I was living at the time after I got out of the Navy. There was actually a Linux users group in Honolulu when I had gotten out of the Navy, called Luau, which at the time stood for Linux Users Anonymous, which I thought was terrible. It sounded like they were ashamed of using Linux. So eventually I became the organizer of that group, and we changed the name to Linux Unix Advocates and Users. And it was still Luau. And, lots of IRC. And as I had to explain to my son recently, my 10-year-old didn't know what IRC was. And I told him it's the boomer version of Slack. Now, how's it going for me these days after working in those open source communities? Well, for example, I just got back from ApacheCon, which is an international conference for the Apache Free Software Foundation, or the Apache Software Foundation, where I was speaking about one of their main projects, Apache Camel. And I've been basically most of the way around the world speaking about software development, open source, and communities, security, information technologies, helping to build more effective teams. I still contribute to open source projects on a regular basis. I recently contributed to a project called Keycloak, which is a single sign-on service. And I also contributed to another project called Infinispan, which is sort of like an open source version of Redis that's actually really high performance. And I was recognized this year by Red Hat as a recipient of their Chairman's Award, which is probably their most prestigious award for just general people in Red Hat. They give out maybe 5 or 6 a year out of 22,000 employees. So you could say, based on my ability to get involved in these open source communities, I was able to build an extremely successful career. Even as a college dropout, high school graduate, I wouldn't say I'm self-taught. I was taught by the community. And with that, I'll hand it off to, I think Jeff is next in the list.
I am, yes, thank you. As Devin said, my name is Jeff. I am Jeff Squires. I'm a principal engineer at Cisco, the networking company, not the food company. I feel like every time I say that in the Midwest, I have to give that disclaimer because everybody's like, oh, you make snacks. No, I make networking software. I'm similar to Devin in many ways and different in many ways. I started off when I was a kid. I read, it's not even the boomer version of a computer. It's just plain old ancient. If you've heard of the TRS-80, then you're doing pretty good in your history class. That was what I started on as a kid. That kind of parlayed into me writing some cash register software for my dad's hardware store, to True Value for what felt like a million years. And then I went to school and I stayed there for a long time, including Army ROTC and some active and reserve duty and all that kind of good stuff. I was a signal officer, so I did a bunch of electronics and communications and that kind of things for the Army. But I went on, what I mean by a million years of school is that I did both undergraduate and graduate school. So Devin at the beginning and Amy called me Dr. Squires. That's true. I have a PhD, which just means I took a lot of classes. And I was in school for a long, long time. But graduate school was really great for me. It really started the senior year of my undergraduate when I met this professor who went on to become my graduate school advisor and professor, and he really showed me what mentorship was all about. He led me through a lot of things when I thought I was a super smart guy, and he's like, I think there's still a bunch of things you can learn, and he nudged me and encouraged me and showed me all kinds, worlds that I had never even thought existed before. And early in my graduate career, I got involved in something called high performance computing, or HPC. Think of it as really, really big number crunching. So using, the computation is so big, it's not just on one server in the data center, it's across tens, hundreds, or sometimes even thousands of servers all working together to solve a single computational problem. And so I got involved in that a lot in graduate school, and not just from my professor, but also from a lot of professors from a lot of different organizations, not just at my school, and other graduate students and government researchers. I learned from all kinds of luminaries in the HPC space. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of the HPC space, both back then, which was in the 90s, and now is open source. And that, I never would have believed it, but that actually launched my career. So I've been doing HPC for a long time. And a lot of our code is still open source, and I still do that for Cisco. So in Cisco, how it's going now, I worked on our VIC team, which is our network card for our servers. So I wrote the software and the drivers, and well, I've had several jobs at Cisco. I did the VIC job for a bunch of years. The most recent couple of years, I've done cloud-based virtualization and delivery and whatnot. But through all of that, I've been able to be a frequent contributor to several open source projects like OpenMPI and HWLoc and some others, and a random contributor to many. Every time I see a bug or a piece of software that we're using and we need a feature in it, we'll go just write it and then we'll contribute it upstream so that everybody benefits from that feature or bug fix or whatever. So I have random commits in a lot of different software packages, even though I am nowhere near any kind of core contributor in those packages. It's just kind of neat to be able to say, oh, I can fix that little thing. Let me submit it. Boom, there you go. And I can tell you from some of the packages that I am a core contributor on, when we get random submissions like that, man, it's fantastic. You're like, wow, I got a bug fix for a bug that I didn't even know I had. But some random person out in the world is like, oh, I noticed you had a little problem. Let me fix it for you and submit the fix to you. That is just fantastic. And then the last thing is that in the last 15, 20 years or so, I discovered IT volunteerism. So I've done a lot of volunteer work in both helping maintain networks and write a little code here and there at like my kids' school and other places like that. It's a great way to kind of push yourself and learn something new. Like, oh, you don't know anything about Wi-Fi? Well, I'll bet the local animal shelter has terrible Wi-Fi. Why don't you go down there and see if you can volunteer and help them out? Because most people don't even know they have bad Wi-Fi, or one of 1,000 other things like that. So similar to Devin, you know, my span has gone many years. I mean, notice the gray hair here, right? But a lot of different things. And a lot of it was unlocked by open source communities and learning from other people who I didn't even know existed, and yet they were able to share, you know, their world and their knowledge with me. And I've tried to do my best to carry that on. I've stayed in open source for all these years, and I love mentoring people and bringing them up on new technologies and old technologies too, just to learn and do new things, because it's a fantastic world out there and we can create great things together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liang here and let him go.
Okay, yeah. First, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a true honor to present here. Like you see, not like the two big dogs in front, I'm kind of less experienced, but I hope what I'm going to say next could give you the confidence. Some could give you the encouragement. Someone like me could do work in open source. Definitely, each of you could do that. So I actually came from China, and all my kind of grown up history is there. It's quite a different country. So surprisingly, I never touched a computer kind of before 18, before go to college. It's quite new to us. I saw that, but it's quite expensive. Probably very limited people could afford such a computer. And we don't even have such a class there. But when I get into the college, so we kind of have this kind of access to it. We started first at the C programming language there. And also we also have the assembly language there. So we only have limited time to practice computer. So before that, we basically needed to write the code in paper and practice there. It's quite interesting. But things changed after that. We grew very fast. So in my third year of the college. So after I worked 2 years in a computer company there, I finally DIY'd one on my own computer, one piece by piece. So I could get the kind of the cheapest price there. It's kind of interesting, but it do help me understand the whole computer structure, which is awesome, which is very good for the continued learning of all the computer science stuff. So after actually based on the learning process, I actually start my career, my work, professional work in the non-OS stuff far earlier before Linux. So I was actually working on I'm from the mechanical department there. So I work more on the automatic control system there. So like we needed to design a control system for a whole factory, manufacturing pipeline there. So like we have this whole embedded board or the PLC from the Siemens, ABB, the companies there, and we design the control system. We design all the sensors to get the speed, the temperature there, and we design the control system, how to control them all. So mostly we need use C, but some specific times we may need to assembly code there. That's kind of that's just so trivial. I didn't say it's not good, but it's so difficult. You design a full function unit there. You need much more lines there. So this is the very beginning. This kind of what I did for my kind of colleague topic there to graduate topic there. So I got my first job to working on this kind of CAD/CP CAM company. It's called the Amada. It's actually in Japan. The application is called AP100. That's kind of 2008, 2009. But this application is developed much earlier. It's like 1980 sometimes developed there. But we needed to maintain it. We developed based on it. There's kind of hundreds of thousands of lines there, C++ code and C code. It's not open source. It's all commercial software. So that's kind of interesting because I thought all the software should run in that way. I have no idea of open source. Like all the applications should be compiled into a DLL or EXE. Yes, you may notice it's not even Linux, it's the Windows. We're using the Visual Studio to compile there. I thought that's the way. And I've been working there a couple of years. Because that application is very like a compiler. We needed to compile all graphic, the geometry information into the machine code for the machine there, G code. So from there, I got quite interested in all the compiler stuff. And then I found the booming of the OpenStack or virtualization, because the OpenStack is quite popular at that time. Because I needed to learn by myself, so I needed to check code. I actually use VMware first for all the for the virtual machine stuff, but I kind of see the code. I kind of do research, learn by myself. So I dig it a little further. I found the QEMU, and for the big system, I got the OpenStack. It really quite it just changed my mind. Or I thought open source before is like the AP100 there. A couple of people working in the same building, different people working on different module. And then to send, finally you got all the EXE file, and then you send it to the customer. But now comes to the OpenStack. It's the people from all over the world, and it's reviewed publicly. It's building publicly, and you could see all the information there. And you also need thinking like some at first I'm not even comfortable like to put my code publicly to write the login information, like what about my English is not good, what about like people will laugh at the code, the writing there. But with the time on, I feel like it's quite friendly unity, and the people from the open source community, it's pretty friendly. And because it's also abroad the world, I started looking from Japan, and then I come to America here, and people like all the people from it's everywhere, and people just work as the team, like in the same building, in the same flow. So that make me like, wow, I want to work in this way. So after that, I want to make a change. So I apply a master program here in America. I went to school here. In Michigan, actually. I focus on all the virtualization stuff, and I actually used the CentOS there as the Linux distro, doing the research on Zen. Quite interesting, and it gives me to the work to the HP Hewlett Packard. It's not split yet, so by the Helium Cloud team. It's similar with, it's based on OpenStack. It's kind of different, it's a vendor distro. But all the code is still open source. And we are working on a Linux distro. I own Linux, customary Linux distro, it's Linux. So that's really give me idea, like it's open source. And also, how do you want to distribute your stuff in open source way, like a Linux package here. So we working on the kernel, we working on the QEMU package there. It's finally like to thinking in this way. That's I feel the most wow, after all these years by commercial software looking open source, finally really working in the open source. That's the entry point to me. After that, I moved to SUSE. I think SUSE is the most important milestone to me. So we're really working on that, and we really do that. So I understand like how to maintain, how to maintain itself, how to collaborate with upstream up there, and how to deliver to the end users there. And even like, how do you make a profit out of it? But I think Devin should definitely know about that part, profiting of.
Oh no, I just woke up way too early. This is actually really interesting. I'm learning a lot about you guys tonight.
Yeah, just kidding there. But anyway, so eventually today I'm moving to the DigitalOcean. So it's not a fully open source there, but I can see it's turning that way. But the most important and meaningful part to me is that I can help with this transformation. I can try to make a difference there. I can encourage them to do this way. I can lead the example this way. I can, like, if it has questions, I may like to post in upstream to discuss. I will try, when working on something, I may thinking to post some patches first. I really enjoy this one. I think I can make a difference here. I can really propagate the open source culture here. But I definitely see our company is running in this way, is turning in this way. So that's a really good stage to me at the moment. Like I said, yeah, it's not quite a time history for me for this whole process. I'm still on the way. It's, you just feel the each year, like totally. I just talk with Jeff and then learn, like each year you may have different opinion, totally different thinking about open source. But no matter what, just thinking that, engage that, it will be much easier than you thought, and you will get much more than you expect. So yeah, that's my thing. Back to you, Ken.
So really, that was all the prepared stuff that we had to talk about. We really wanted to open the floor to questions. I will plug one thing though. As was stated at the beginning of this, Devin, Liang, and myself are all part of this KYOS thing. And what that stands for is the Kentucky Open Source Society, KYOSS. And we meet on the second Tuesdays of every month. So 2 days from now, actually. At the 700 North building on Hurstbourne Parkway on the first floor. There's just a conference room. We meet there, and it's just a free for anyone to join and show up, and we just talk about open source stuff. Usually we have 1 to 2 presentations scheduled about something open sourcey, and then we also just chat around. So it's a great opportunity to just kind of learn something outside your comfort zone, something you didn't know before. An opportunity to talk to people and ask questions without embarrassment, because we are there to share knowledge. And tonight too, some of you may be a little nervous to ask us questions. Please don't be. We are here to actually help bring you, all 3 of us were where you are today at one point, right? We had to ask somebody and say, hey, you just said some acronym and I don't know what that is. Can you please explain that to me? Or you said this sentence and I understood the first part of it, but not the second part of it. What were you talking about? So please feel free to ask us these questions either tonight and or at the monthly KYOS meetings. All of these things are fair game for us, because honestly, we're all old guys and we've been doing this for forever. And sometimes we just kind of barrel through something and assume that people know stuff that you might not, and that's our bad. So please ask us questions about anything and everything.
Yeah, and I want to kind of expand on a little bit what Jeff's saying there is, because I have benefited so much from the open source communities, to me, it is my responsibility to give back and turn around and mentor and help the next generation of people that are coming up through these communities. These communities have made me capable of having an amazing lifestyle. And I think everybody deserves that opportunity if they're interested.
Absolutely. And someone said this to me. I was not the guy who said it, but I think it's a great quote. I don't care who you are, nobody does their best work alone, right? And that means even if you think you're a super smart person, there's someone who has a different perspective than you that will make you think differently and you'll come to a better solution. Just the act of talking out a problem. I mean, in my job at Cisco, my bosses routinely ask me to do things that I have no idea how to do. And I have to go figure it out, right? Sometimes that means talking to people. Sometimes that means reading oodles and oodles of documentation. Sometimes that means just trying a bunch of code and seeing what works. Sometimes it means all of the above. But almost always it involves more people than just me. So, you know, I echo everything that Devin said there. It is our responsibility, the gray-haired old engineers here, to bring the new generation along, because honestly, we learn off of you as well. So yeah, I can keep saying the same thing 7 different ways, but it's all true.
All right. So Emily, do we have any questions in the queue? I don't see anything in chat.
No, nobody's put anything in chat yet. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to either use the reactions button to raise your hand or just go ahead and shout it out. How about I start with one question I have? What is a simple way that one could get started? Like finding a project that one might be interested in.
So in general, start with things that you're at least familiar with. If you're coming through Code Louisville, maybe you're already familiar with using a little bit of React or a little bit of Node.js, or maybe you know some PHP or some C#. Go and look at those various projects and their open source upstream. So like if you're into React, you can go to GitHub, you can look at the React repository. And let's say, especially as a new developer, as someone who's just starting in the industry, it's really helpful to have your perspective because you're going to look at that documentation from a perspective as a beginner, and you're going to see where there's holes, where there's flaws in their documentation. And if you can help improve that documentation based on what you're learning and how your experience is helping you get better, documentation is always the first place I recommend people contribute. If you can help improve the documentation on an open source project, you make it that much more accessible to everybody else. I would say personally, 60% of my contributions are documentation. I mean, I do the hard technical stuff too, but it's so easy to contribute improvements to documentation. I do it quite a bit.
Yeah, let me. I'm gonna emphasize that, and even +1 on that. That just writing code is not the only way to contribute. Documentation is a great way, as Devin said, but also testing and reporting bugs. And like, hey, you guys are just about to release a new version, so I'm going to download it. I'm going to try it. I'm going to run my existing, homework assignments that I did in Code Louisville. Oh, they don't work. Why don't they work? Oh, you have a bug. Reporting bugs. That's also super helpful. Part of the open source, philosophy and ethos is that we develop this stuff in the open, right? GitHub.com is a very popular site where a lot of open source is developed. Not all of it, but it's super popular. And you can find, by the way, we've been using a term upstream here a lot. I don't know if we define that very well. What we mean when we say upstream is typically the main repository where that package is developed. So Devin was talking about PHP, Node.js, and so on. You can go find the main repository where that code is developed. Probably all of those are on GitHub. Devin, do you know offhand? Let's just assume that they are for the purposes of this conversation.
Probably.
Yeah, you could just go find them and find their documentation, find their code, find their testing, find the upcoming releases and whatnot like that. And if you see like, oh, I found a grammar error in your documentation, great. It doesn't have to be a big contribution, a spelling, a typo fix, or you know what, you guys didn't document this part very well, and I'm gonna write you 3 paragraphs about it. That stuff is fantastic too, right? So yeah, all of those things.
Excellent. I believe that William had raised his hand for a bit. William, do you still have a question?
No, it was actually answered. My question was, one, I'm like not an experienced programmer coder. I'm afraid to do any open source because I'm afraid to mess up. But then also like where to get started. But that question was answered. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
So I highly recommend don't be afraid to get started. The worst that will happen is that someone will reject your contribution. And generally, this is just my experience, and my experience may be biased because I'm an old white dude and have a very Western sounding name, and sometimes that has an effect. But generally what happens is someone will say, this is why we're not going to take your contribution, and they'll explain to you something you may not have been aware of, or a reason that they're not willing to integrate your change, or things like that. It's getting better in the open source community. There are still some communities that will reject you out of hand. I'm sure Liang has seen people that are not patient enough to deal with people who are, English as a second language participants. I know I have been rejected from communities that are, Russian speaking in the past, and just because I don't speak Russian. So that can be a challenge.
Yeah, but that being said, I echo again. I'm just echoing everything Devin says tonight. Don't be afraid. Go ahead, submit that pull request. Just do it. Particularly, start small, right? Don't try and bite off a giant new feature that like, oh, you look on the Node.js repository and they're like, oh, here's our roadmap and we want to do this new cool feature. You're like, cool, I'm going to do that. Don't make that your first thing. Make your first thing be something nice and small. Whether it's writing 3 paragraphs or fixing 1 typo in the document, whatever it is, that gets your name up in the community, right? And they'll be like, oh, Right. That Joe Smith guy, right? He's contributed to us before. It seems like he's sticking around and doing a little more extra work. That kind of buys you credibility with that community too. So, go ahead and start small, and then you can get bigger as you get more confident and you know the people and you start understanding the software a little bit more. It just kind of naturally builds. But don't be afraid. Go ahead. A lot of people who are involved in open source are in the same boat as you, that they started from somewhere and got to being a core maintainer or developer where they are today. But all that takes time. Everybody had to start somewhere.
Liang, anything to add to that?
Yes, I just want to add one more situation here. Like sometimes you send a patch, you send a PR outside, it may be acquired for a while. You feel like ignored. That's totally normal, because like the maintainer would be like all kind of a situation. It may not be his official professional work there. Sometimes, for example, like what I'm doing here, I saw some maintainer, they only do every Monday there. Basically, if you send something out, you need to wait the whole week to wait for that, maybe even longer. So if you feel ignored, just send a ping outside, send again, remind people, asking like a review or comments there politely. I think they will reply to you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna throw one more definition out there. We keep saying PR too, or pull request. That's the if you haven't done this yet, that is the mechanism on GitHub to which you suggest code to some upstream repository. We say, hey, Node.js, will you take this code from me and make it as part of your repository? That's called a pull request or a PR.
Yeah. So it looks like we have a question from Andreas. Am I pronouncing that right? Andreas, do you want to actually come online and speak your question?
Yeah, sure, guys. So yeah, I don't know how much this is related to the open source, but I know that just working with a few services, there are some stuff that is open source, but I've been kind of learning bits of codes and languages. I know a little bit of React and Python.
Nice.
I just kind of got into a new job where I'm able to learn, and I was able to set up an account for this distribution center, and I've been deploying some small apps using some functions there, some serverless stuff, and also some server-based stuff. And I mean, you guys have been in the industry for a while, so I was just kind of got really excited about this services, and I feel like it's the I guess if you're putting together a puzzle, it's the bottom of the puzzle to where all the pieces that I've been learning are fitting in. What would you say about a career in some services, cloud services? Where do you see that?
So
into the future?
Cloud services is a pretty broad and vague term. We'll start with that.
Okay.
It can encompass way more than any one person could ever master very easily. There's a lot of capabilities there. These days, when we're talking about, at least in my company, we refer to them as the hyperscalers: Amazon, Google, Azure, IBM, and Oracle, and DigitalOcean to almost as much of an extent. These are companies that intentionally run extremely dense data centers with co-located services that you can subscribe to without having to manage them yourselves. That's what we refer to as a hyperscaler. Those managed services are often referred to as cloud services. So when you go to Amazon, instead of running or deploying your own database on a VM, you can subscribe to use Aurora or RDS. Or if you go to Azure, you can use Azure Database Service, Azure SQL Server. Or if you go to Google, you can use Bigtable or whatever, right? Instead of having to manage and set up your own database. That could be a cloud service. Cloud services are very useful. They can be extremely useful, but also realize that from the various vendors' perspective, they are a tool to try to lock you into their ecosystem. So for example, if you get used to using DynamoDB inside of AWS, and let's say AWS raises their rates or starts to get or you get an offer from Azure that's less expensive, or from Google to decrease your cloud spend, you would have to rewrite the code that integrates you with DynamoDB to work on Bigtable or Firebase in order to move clouds. So that is something to keep in mind. It doesn't really change the calculus for a lot of my customers, at least. Some of them are quite happy to stay with AWS forever, or stay with Azure forever, or stay with GCP forever. But realize that when you say cloud services, there's more there than you could probably master in a lifetime.
Now, that
Yeah.
being said, I'm going to take a positive spin on it, meaning that is tons of opportunity there, right? So Devin is totally right. There is more than you can master in an entire lifetime. But that also means you have a giant ecosystem to play in and to figure out like, ooh, let's go do this today. Let's go do that tomorrow. There is tons of things that you can explore and learn and find out about. And but Devin is totally right. There is a dark side that vendors do tend to lock you in, and sometimes they raise rates and you're like, oh man, DynamoDB from Amazon now costs way too much, and I'm going to have to move to Microsoft Azure and use their equivalent because it's cheaper. But look at it, the glass half full way. That's something new you can go learn, right? Now you do have to go adapt your software because the APIs are going to be all different, but it's, you don't just take the code and what you're doing as a job as the only thing that you can learn. There is so many other opportunities to expand your knowledge, even in something that you don't think is going to be useful today, right? Like all this work that I've done at my kids' high school has nothing at all to do with what I do for my job. But every once in a while, something I had to go learn for my kids' high school because we did a new Wi-Fi deployment in a different way, blah, 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 all the things, randomly 3 parts of that became important in what I had to do in a day-to-day job at Cisco for completely unrelated reasons, right? So the stuff that you learn just expands your knowledge and will manifest in, unexpected ways that like, oh, wow, that thing I happened to pick up a year ago is now suddenly I can use that today. And I didn't even expect that would happen. So anyway, I digressed wildly off of cloud services, but the point being, cloud services are great. There are limitations to them, as Devin talked about, and are very worth thinking about, but they are super fun. They're really hot right now. They're very popular with both small and large companies. So, getting your feet wet and learning about these things, learning how to use them, how to deploy them, how to manage them, how to write software for them, that is not a bad place to go in a career right now.
Thank you. That sounds good. Kind of what I was hoping to hear.
All right, we have 2 people with their hands up. The first one is William.
Hey, back again. Question, how would you represent your contributions to open source on your portfolio? Do you specify like exactly what you worked on, or do you just
Great
say,
question.
I contributed to this entire application? And then a follow-up question on that would be, like, what is the coolest open source project that you see going on as far as like within the Kentucky open source community? Thank you.
All right, Devin, you want to take the contribution one? All right, I'll take that one, and then you guys talk about the coolest one, because I think we're all going to have wildly different answers on that. In terms of, the question was, how do you represent what you've done in open source, like on a resume and whatnot? Definitely shrink it down to a bullet and say, hey, I have contributed to this project. And if you can fit in, like a 1-sentence thing, well, depending on how much space you're trying to use on your resume, a super brief description of what you've done. Whether it's like, I fixed up a bunch of their documentation, I wrote this feature, I did this. Or if you've done 20 things, then say, I've done a whole bunch of things. Go look at the GitHub, right? That's the great thing. It's all there for prospective employers to go look at. They can go see your code. I will tell you, every single candidate that I apply or that I interview for our team, if they list a GitHub on there or the things that they've done, I go look at it. I go look at their commits and their pull requests and their pet projects and their other contributions because I want to see how they write code. So that is a fantastic aspect of open source, is that your work product has your name on it indelibly for forever out there on GitHub, and prospective employers can go look at it. Not only that, you can go look at other people's and learn from that. So there's all kinds of good things about contributing to open source that benefits you both learning and also you networking and looking for jobs and applying for jobs and things like that. So Devin, Liang, you want to talk about what your favorite open source projects are right now?
Okay, yeah, I'm mostly working on kernel, because I'm mostly working on the virtualization part. So it's the kernel KVM module or QEMU or some other kind of virtualization, Firecracker, Cloud Hypervisor, something like that. It's similar with QEMU, but written in Rust. So it's not easy. It's not like if you are really interested. But I do kind of recommend the language today. Like when I'm working on this stuff, I noticed that like for Rust or Golang there are a lot of opportunities there. Like if you want to do there, sometimes it's just a simple translation. Someone wrote some stuff in C, Python, PHP. You can write similar stuff in Golang, in Rust, and create a module, craft there. You will be the owner, and you can also be the maintainer if you like. So that would be very helpful.
Yeah, let me throw a few more definitions out there. So Liang was talking about a whole bunch of different languages there, computer languages. So I think in Code Louisville, you guys do some PHP and JavaScript and Node.js and React and things like that. Liang and I tend to work way down deep in the stack. So in the virtualization area or in the network area, we are multiple levels down below React and PHP and whatnot. So we're like in the guts of how the operating system actually works. A lot of that code is written in C, as Liang cited, some in C++, but two very popular languages that are getting more prevalent down there is Rust and Go, or people say Golang, but Golang, those are pretty much the same things. No, they are the same thing. They're just two different variations of the same name. But you know what Liang was trying to point out, which is I think is great, is Rust is kind of this up and coming one. There's even been a bunch of press recently about how there's now Rust down in the Linux operating system kernel itself, the very first workings of it, and it's actually very exciting. But it's kind of a newer language. It's only what, like 5-7 years old, maybe 10 at tops. And so it doesn't have all the functionality that's available in, like, say, Python or Go or C++. And you could go write a module in Rust that exists in some of these other languages and become the owner and maintainer. That being said, it's kind of an advanced thing to do because you're so far down in the stack. It might be a little further along in your career before you get to do that. But these kinds of opportunities are available. Devin, you're giving me the stink eye there. You might not agree with everything I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on Rust. Because Rust is fully library compatible with C and C++, anything that you can do in a library in C, you can do in a library in Rust. The main difference is the way that you do memory management. Yeah, and we're not going to go into those details because that's a real deep rabbit hole. For me, interesting open source projects that are coming around and being worked on. So we've had a couple of people here in the Louisville area work on both Berkeley Internet Name Daemon, which is one of the most widely used DNS domain name servers. So when you type in google.com into your browser, the computer doesn't really understand that. It has to send that name off to a domain name server, and the domain name server sends back an internet address that the computer does understand. So Berkeley Internet Name Daemon has been around for decades, multiple decades. The version 9 release is the current release. I have contributed to it. There's one of my colleagues, Michael Spears, who lives here in town, has contributed to it. Brian Smith, who also is here from here in Louisville, has also contributed to Berkeley Internet Name Daemon. So that one is a big one because it runs large swaths of the internet. A lot of the internet just fails to work without DNS and bind, which is cool. So that's one that I would mention. We have a number of people in Kentucky and Indiana that contribute to projects that are part of either the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So as mentioned before, open source doesn't really have a company behind it in a lot of cases, or in some cases at all. But a lot of companies depend on open source software. And to make sure that there are people to maintain and continue working on and patching and fixing bugs and things like this, a lot of large companies will come together and form these software foundations, like ASF, like Eclipse, like CNCF, and they'll donate large sums of money and the foundation will help maintain that software. So if you've heard of Kubernetes, Kubernetes is a project under the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's funded by Microsoft, Google, Amazon, IBM, Red Hat, hundreds of different corporations contribute. DigitalOcean, I'm sure, contributes. Cisco, I'm sure, contributes. And then if you go and look at various projects under the Apache Software Foundation, there are, I don't know, 200, 300 top-level ASF projects. They are basically all the foundations for all of those cloud services that Andreas mentioned earlier. So if you're going to go consume DynamoDB inside of Amazon, that's based on some open source software from the Apache Software Foundation. I think it's Catalyst, Apache Catalyst. Or if you're going to go and use a search engine service provided by either Microsoft Azure or AWS and their open search project, that's based on an Apache project called Lucene and another Apache project called Solar. So these open source projects are the underpinnings. They are the foundations of almost all of modern cloud in this day and age. You can't look at, well, for example, if you have a smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android, doesn't matter. It's running open source software and probably running quite a bit of Apache Software Foundation software. So for example, on your Android phones, the logging framework that they use is part of Apache Log4j. So
open source software is everywhere.
It runs the entire freaking world now. Runs on my watch, runs on my phone, it runs on my servers, it runs on mainframes.
Yeah, a lot of Cisco products, our switches, our routers, our phones, a lot of them are running some flavor of Linux or something that was originally derived from Linux underneath the covers. So, you're just seeing a switch that, switches moves packets around and things like that. Under the covers, there's probably Linux doing a bunch of the accounting underneath the covers.
So for those of you that are thinking about careers and you're looking for a way to found a strong, long career, getting involved in some of these open source projects that are managed by these foundations, what generally happens is if you become a regular trusted contributor, somebody's going to hire you to do that full time. So for example, I started working on Eclipse Vertex many years ago, about 8-9 years ago. I got hired by Red Hat specifically for that knowledge for working in that community. And I would assume, Liang, probably your work in OpenStack, QEMU, KVM got you hired at SUSE, got you hired at DigitalOcean.
Mm-hmm. My work in the HPC community got me hired at Cisco.
Yeah.
Right. So open source does not necessarily mean that the software, production grade software is not free to develop. There are tons of companies behind it, and they pay people like the three of us to actually work on it on a day-to-day basis. Hey, we could probably keep going on this for a while, but I see that Ian has been patiently waiting, and I don't want to run out of time.
Hi.
Hi, Ian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So earlier in the presentation, we talked a bit about the difficulties of breaking into a community outside of your native language. But I also assume there are many positive and beneficial aspects to work, if you're bilingual, to working on a project that is written in your second language. And I was wondering if I could maybe get some more information about that.
Liang, I think you are probably the best one to talk about this.
Yes, just let me sum it if I understand the question right. You're asking like, even though the lingual language difficulty would be a problem, but there would be also benefit, and you want to see how this goes, how to help the developing, or is that right?
Yeah, I'm sure there is a lot to bring to the table if you speak multiple languages that could be beneficial, especially if other people on that team are only speak the one language.
Okay, yes. So it could affect in different ways and different directions. For example, even we are thinking, we're using the language we are talking, the language the machine is talking there. So that's kind of why I'm quite interested in compiler at the first place. So yes, it's we needed to thinking like how to let other people understand you. Like even you programming there, you needed to make other people understand you. Then you needed to thinking about a very simple way. You use the simple structure, simple algorithm there, and then describe it in a simple comment information there. So somehow this is kind of the idea, like sometimes the simple is the better. The other way is kind of a diversity, like not only the language, the culture, it's just different. I working with like my coworker, or even with the open source there, you could see all kind of different people, like they especially work with open source. Like sometimes you may somehow you don't know you offended them, and or they kind of do the same thing to you, but deep down they didn't mean that. So it's just quite interesting. So it come out like just don't be afraid, don't be. It's like just do it and communicate with it. More communication there, everything would be better.
Let me
And I
throw.
want to add real quick
Yeah.
on top of that. It's not just language as well. New perspectives come from all sorts of different diverse backgrounds. I have colleagues that are, either visually impaired or auditory impaired or physically impaired, and they bring really valuable perspectives to how we develop software that takes into account their particular background, their particular needs and requirements. And if you are a white cisgendered male that has no disabilities, that speaks English, you're probably not going to think about the needs of a amputee living in Latin America that only speaks Portuguese. But when you start working in open source communities, you get exposed to all those different cultures, all those different languages, all those different backgrounds. And it broadens the way you think about developing and designing software.
Yeah, and diversity is super important, but the question was specific about language. So I want to jump back to that one for a second. There's a couple of different frameworks for different languages and different libraries and whatnot that focus on, oh, I've written the code and now I have a whole bunch of like dialog boxes and other things like that. And like, oh, okay, these are in English. Oh, but I can swap all of those out and put in the French text instead, and the German text and the Spanish text and the Portuguese text. And so they have like a data file of like, all right, this English string corresponds to that French string and that Portuguese string, and you can swap them in and out. And so having multilingual people that help develop and maintain like this I'm going to say database, but it's not really a database. This correlation and translation of strings for every new release of a software package is really, really important. And getting people who are either fluent or native language speakers is really, really helpful. Even if you're not a core developer, you can take a bunch of these messages and say, oh, in English, that means this, but I have to look at the context and make sure I get the context right in the target language and so on. So that is, you know, the internationalization of the text and messages that software print out is very much a thing, and developers always need help with that stuff. Always. So that's another great place to go contribute in open source.
And one last little thing I'll add on top of that is they've recently done studies that learning programming languages activates the parts of the brain that are most similar to learning foreign languages, other spoken languages. So knowing other spoken languages can help you learn more programming languages. Knowing more programming languages can make it easier for you to learn more spoken languages.
Yeah. Yeah, just add one more about the programming language here. So similarly with the speaking language, it may be like if possible, you may learn more than one programming language there to feel the difference there, and it will help you understand how the operating system, how the computer works there, how the compiler works, because there is some difference between languages, and you needed to. You only needed to go to some level, you could feel that the difference, and it's quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, we've been throwing around a bunch of languages tonight: C, C++, Rust, Golang, Python, JavaScript, and whatnot. Once you learn a second, like if you're taking a class right now, you're learning a little React and things like that. Well, maybe take Python next time, and you're going to see things that are similar and things that are different. But there's a lot of commonality between all these languages and a bunch of differences that go off in 90 degrees from the language that you learned before. So that type of stuff is deliciously fun to learn.
Yeah, like Jeff mentioned a language called Rust earlier. I've actually been having to read Rust code from one of my customers lately. I've never programmed in Rust before, but because I've programmed in other languages, several other, I can go and I can see, Rust is very similar to a lot of other languages. I can trace through the code. I can read what's going on and understand it.
But definitely don't get into the loop. The more is not the better. Just 2 or maybe 3, but don't learn to more than that. That would,
I think Liang's poking fun at me because I've professionally worked in 14 languages. Now, what I will say is you can really only become extremely skilled in 2 or 3, like Liang said, and there are going to be 2 or 3 very similar languages. So I know Java really well. I know JavaScript pretty well. I know TypeScript pretty well. When I start diverging out into Python, Ruby, Erlang, Julia, Rust, I know them varying degrees of okay, and I can read most of them. But one thing I will say is sometimes it's useful to look and see how other languages and platforms work, because they will change your perspective of how you approach your primary programming languages. For example, a few years ago, I worked in a project where we ended up using Erlang. Erlang was vastly different than any other programming language I'd ever used before. It was fully functional. There are no loop constructs. Everything is recursion. It's weird, but it also helped me get better at some of the stuff I do in Java on a regular basis around non-blocking and high performance and high throughput. So,
yeah, similar. Several years ago, until several years ago, I was a Perl guy. Perl was my scripting language of choice. And that just shows the gray hair, right? If you've never heard of Perl, it's okay. And I got brought into a project that was written completely in Python, and I was like, oh God, I'm gonna have to learn Python. And after a couple months of it, I'm like, wow, this is pretty great, actually. I really enjoy Python a lot. I've kind of given up on Perl now, and Python is my scripting language of choice. So like Devin said, learning a new language every once in a while, or just, auditing it, learning how to read it and see like, oh, I can see other people's code and more or less figure out what it's doing, even if I don't work in that every day. It's great perspective. It's great just, expand your horizon a little bit, learn a little bit more about this ecosystem that we all work in. It's pretty cool stuff.
Devin learning Rust and Jeff learning Python are great examples of just-in-time learning, which is something that we highly recommend. So, someone asked in chat for the open source community's info, so Leon put in the website again. Any other questions before we finish this presentation?
I just want to add, reiterate what Jeff mentioned earlier. We're having our monthly meeting this Wednesday at 700 North Hurstbourne Parkway. The following Wednesday, we are finally restarting the JavaScript Louisville group in the same location, same time, 6:30 p.m. My employer Red Hat is going to provide pizza for both events. So go to meetup.com, look up either Chaos or JSLou, RSVP so we know how much food to order, and hopefully we'll see some of you at one of the meetups.
And we will
That'd be
find
good.
those links and put them in the Tech Events channel in Slack for anyone who would like to join. Any other questions? Well, gentlemen, thank you so very much for presenting tonight. This has been great. This has been a wonderful introduction into the world of open source, and I hope that everybody at least sticks a toe in and goes and finds a project and finds a typo or something that they can make a suggestion on. So thank you all so very much. Next Monday we will have our final Women in Tech or Monday guest speaker series. So please join us next week as well. Same bat channel, same bat time. Have a good evening and good luck on your projects, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.